Hello readers, I'm Amy and finally doing my June wrap-up, so hopefully I can be a little more on track with my wrap-ups than I was with May. Speaking of May, I forgot to mention the Devour Your TBR challenge for May, which was Moody May, so it was about reading books that you were in the mood for, which for me that month was just Elantris, but I spent most of the month reading Elantris because it was just what I wanted to read, so I'm good on that. As for June, before I forget to mention it, the Devour Your TBR for June is Jazzy June, and it was about rereads, and I had 2 rereads in June. Also, I am changing things up a little bit with my wrap-up, so this is going to be my last full month wrap-up, because I'm just wanting to change things up a little bit. So the books that I read in June that already have individual reviews, I'm not going to discuss in this video. I'll probably link them up above, but I'm just not going to mention them because I already talked about them. From here on out, I'm going to try and do kind of a mini wrap-up every 4 or 5 books or so, not counting books that I do individual reviews for, just because I'm realizing I don't really want to do big wrap-ups anymore. I read, 17 books? 16 or 17 books in June, and the idea of wrapping up all of those books is just exhausting, and I keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off until I have something like May happen where I don't do the wrap-up until July. So I'm just trying to cut that down a little bit so I don't feel like I just don't want to do the wrap-up at all, because I want you to know what I'm reading. Anyways, let's get on to my June stats. So as usual, for this year, every single month I want to read at least 1 novella, 1 Margaret Atwood book, 1 classic, and 1 nonfiction, and I am working on reading at least 6 big books this year, which I actually met that goal back in May, so good for me, but I am still going to be trying to read big books here and there because they scare me a little bit. And by big books, I mean a book that is 500 or more pages. According to the Story Graph, which I've started using and really loving as an alternative to Goodreads, I generally read in the 3 to 350, 400 range, so it's good for me to extend that a little bit. And I actually met all of those goals this month. I read a novella, an Atwood, a classic, a nonfiction, and a big book, so good for me. I read 16 total books. Wasn't 17, it was 16, which is still a lot of books. Right now there are 2 of those books that I won't be discussing, but I will link them up above if you want to know more. Of those 16 books, 7 were audiobooks, 4 were ebooks, and 5 were physical books. And countries that I read, I actually have a pretty good number on countries this month. I read 10 books from America, 1 book from Guadeloupe, I think is how you say it. Technically it's a French book, but I think they call it French because it was written in French. The author is from Guadeloupe, so that's what I put for the country. 1 book from Nigeria, 2 books from Canada, a book from England, a book from France, and a book from Australia. 10 of those books were library books, and 6 were owned. 7 were nonfiction, and 9 were fiction. 2 were male, 12 had female authors, and 3 of them have trans authors. And 1 of those by a female author is actually about a trans person. And I thought that the trans person actually wrote the book, and they didn't. It was just about them. But I'm finally getting out of that male author, female author binary, which is nice, because I really enjoyed the books that I read that didn't fit into the binary. So, good for me on that one. So let's get started here. For Jazzy June, like I said, that was my rereads. I started off the month with The Bell Jar, which I actually started in May for Mental Healthathon and finished in June. I love this book. I've read this, 4 or 5 times now? I love it. It's actually also one of the only classics that I know of that discusses mental health. There's just not that many classic books that go into it. So for that, I'm really grateful. And Sylvia Plath is just a beautiful author. I don't have much to say about this book. I am actually curious about some of her poetry. I do have the book Letters from Sylvia Plath. It's letters to and from her mom. So I am curious about some of her other stuff, but I'm also nervous because I'm not really a huge poetry person, but I really like her novels, so I feel like I should eventually give her poetry a chance, but I don't know. If you want to know my thoughts on poetry, watch the last video that I uploaded, because I updated my thoughts on poetry. Then next was White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. This was for a readathon, which we were supposed to do White Rage and White Fragility, and I tried to get both on Scribd, and White Fragility, it was like a sampler or something, so I just read White Rage, which I did really like. I gave it 4.5 stars. It's not my favorite book because White Rage, I thought White Rage would discuss things a bit differently. I guess I don't know what I expected from it. But basically it's a book on history, which was really interesting because I like history. I think history is fascinating. However, history books don't tend to have a style of writing that I like. They tend to be a little bit dry. This book didn't really change my thoughts on that. It did read a little dry, but the history information was so interesting and told me so much that I didn't know that I'm like, I'm gonna give it 4.5 stars anyways. 5 stars on Goodreads. I haven't learned about the Reagan administration that much, so I had no idea that the war on drugs was something that we created. Learned about how mass incarceration was part of the fallout of slavery. Like, we have to do something with these black people because they're still not equal to us, so let's just put all of them in prison. And I'm like, interesting. So now I'm really, really interested in reading about mass incarceration. Like, I want to know more about that topic. It's fascinating. It's horrible. We should probably stop this thing. So I'm hopefully going to read some more books on that. I still need to read The New Jim Crow, which I haven't done yet. I ordered a book from a black-owned bookstore on prisons, and they actually had to close down their store. And they have lots of volunteers helping them wrap up all of these books, and they're ordering in all of these books to send off to people, so it's probably going to be a while until I see that one. But good for them, because clearly they're getting some love that they needed. Anyways, next book was I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. This is a YA, so it wasn't, as usual, it wasn't my favorite book of the month, because YA is just not usually my thing. The writing just doesn't quite do it for me in most YA books, but I did really enjoy this. I thought it would be interesting to learn a little bit more about Mexican culture and dynamics. My husband is half Mexican, my mother-in-law is full Mexican. This book reminded me a lot of my mother-in-law. All the love to her. But I saw in the parental figures of this book, let's just say I saw a lot of my mother-in-law. I understand her a little bit better now, thanks to this book. This is just a lot of this girl feeling like her sibling is the perfect Mexican daughter, and her sibling died before the beginning of the novel, and there's the fallout from that, and feeling like she's not good enough, and dealing with the culture that she has and the life that she wants. It was good. I enjoyed it as much as I would really typically enjoy any YA book, I guess. Children of Ruin. I believe I also started reading that, like, at the beginning of May, and finished it in June. This, I also have a reading vlog of it, so I'll just link that in the corner. Basically, giant intelligent spiders and humanity trying to find a new planet on which to live. It was really, really good. I recommend reading it if you're into hard sci-fi at all. I enjoy sci-fi. It's not my favorite. I'm trying to get into sci-fi a little more, but the world building tends to be a little tricky for me. But I loved this. I think it was done really well. Then, Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. This one, I hear a lot about Audre Lorde, how she's completely amazing. Sister Outsider just wasn't the nonfiction book for me, I guess. It's kind of a series of essays. I don't know. I didn't get that much out of it. I liked some of it. I appreciated its discussion of feminism. It's just not my favorite book. Fun fact, Bell Hooks was actually the author that helped me discover feminism, because I had to read Bell Hooks for a writing class in college, and I started reading one of her essays on feminism, and I'm like, feminism! That's a thing! That's gonna be my thing! So, I did actually put a Bell Hooks book on hold at the library because I want to read her again, and visit those early feminist feelings again. Bell Hooks gives me the warm and fuzzies. Audre Lorde, just wasn't my favorite. Tituba. So this book was actually really hard to get a hold of. Turns out I can only buy it on Amazon. Book Depository didn't have a copy. My local bookstore doesn't have a copy. It's just really hard to find. Tituba is based on a real woman who was accused of witchcraft back in Salem, Massachusetts. And her story was fictionalized just to kind of give her more of the life that she deserved rather than the life that she got. So Tituba, Black Witch of Salem. We are looking at a black woman who ends up living with the family of that one girl who was horrible. Abigail, the horrible girl from the Crucible, who's kind of the crux of it all. She starts everything. She keeps everything going. She's just like the worst girl in literary and actual history sometimes. She's living with that family. So, yeah. Content warning for quite a bit of trauma. You know, it's traumatic. It's the witch trials. It's a black woman during the witch trials. It can be a little rough. The beginning was probably the hardest part whenever you're hearing about some of her backstory, but then whenever it gets into the main, like, witchcraft story, it's not too bad. So just a little bit of a content warning for the beginning of this book. But I really loved it. I have so many books written here. What did I end up giving it? I gave it 5 stars. It's great. I recommend it. I hear a lot of people on Twitter are actually really into books on witchcraft and are looking for good books on witchcraft, so I kind of recommend you read this one. Tituba was really into, I don't know, what would you call it, like herbalism, just taking like some natural herbs and making stuff to make people feel better, and, you know, science used to be seen as witchcraft, so there you have that. Then, Sex Work, which I started reading a while ago. February or March. I finally finished it. I didn't actually read the entire thing, so the last, like, third of this book is kind of, here's some information about AIDS, here's some information about STIs, and it was stuff that I already knew, and it was stuff that was a little bit outdated since this book is from the 80s. So I ended up just reading the first 2/3 of it, but I do count it as finished since that was all of the essays from the women in the sex industry. I really enjoyed this. You know, some essays hit harder than others. There were some series of essays that I'm like, meh. But then there were some other ones that I'm just like, this is an amazing story. So you just have these women who are talking about how they got into sex work, how the sex work life treated them, what they did with that work as their lives went on. I think it was really great. I don't know how easy it is to find this book, but I also found it interesting that the people who edited the book are actually the ones who started Cleese Press, which back when I was really into my sex education stuff in my first round of college, I saw a lot of Cleese Press books. They do a lot of erotica, they do a lot of writings about sex work and just books on the sex industry in general. So if you are interested in the sex education, sex work world, Cleese Press is probably the publisher that you want to check out. Then I finally got to read Stay With Me by Ayobami Adebayo. Whenever I looked at interviews, I think that's how they were pronouncing it. Stay With Me is an African kind of drama contemporary book. You are looking at this couple who has a lot of pressure from the family to have babies, and for whatever reason they can't have babies, and so the husband ends up having a second wife pushed onto him by the family. So you're kind of reading like both sides of their story, both sides of their feelings, how that affects their relationship, because they really do love each other, but having an extra wife forced in there can do a lot to a relationship, for better and worse. So it was really awesome to kind of see that dynamic. I ended up listening to the audiobook. The narrator was fantastic. Honestly, when it comes to audiobooks, I tend to like the male narrators better. For whatever reason, the sounds of their voices and their narration just tends to be a better experience for me. However, whenever women are reading the book, I tend to prefer black women narrators. I find that interesting. White women narrators just don't usually do it for me. I don't know if there's a science behind that. I don't know if it's just a personal opinion thing. I guess we're all gonna have our preference for narration voices. I don't know, but that's just something interesting that I learned about myself recently. You know what it is? It's our little Roomba vacuum cleaner. So my husband is cleaning, and if you hear the whooshing sound, it's the vacuum cleaner. Next up was Amateur, a reckoning with gender identity and masculinity. This was written by a trans man, so the whole book is kind of focused on him really get into boxing and trying to train for boxing, and just this whole book is a discussion of what is masculinity, what does it mean to this author, what does it mean to the culture, and I loved it. I liked the writing, I liked the focus on the boxing and masculinity and how that really affects his life, and it kind of changes his views on everything. Really recommend it if you're looking for a short little nonfiction on masculinity and transness. Next one was The Trauma Cleaner. This is also about a trans person. It was written by a female author. The Trauma Cleaner is about a trans woman who does trauma cleaning. She cleans up after crime scenes. Hello, editing Amy here. So my camera cut out during that initial filming, and I thought that it cut out closer to the end of the video, but ends up, no, I'm missing 4 whole books on the end of this, so to just torture you guys with my super late wrap up a little bit longer, let's quickly go over some of those. My classic for the month was East of Eden by John Steinbeck. The only John Steinbeck I have read previously was Of Mice and Men. I originally read it in high school, and then I read it again last year, still loved it. Figured I'd try East of Eden. I want to talk with someone about the character of Kathy. So East of Eden is basically a Cain and Abel kind of biblical retelling, and we have this character of Kathy who's like this evil little girl, and then she turns into a prostitute when she's older, and just she's a very complex character, and she's the kind of character that would be incredibly demonized in the time at which Steinbeck is writing, and she is demonized in this book, but also I feel like Steinbeck handled her pretty well and made her into a complex character, and I just really love her, and I need to talk about her. So if you want to talk about Kathy, get at me in the comments. Then, No True Believers. This is a book about a Muslim family in America, and they're seen as terrorists, and you're kind of going through their lives, seeing how they deal with all of this. There's a lot of bullying, and it's YA. I was kind of enjoying it and learning a little bit about the culture and stuff until it got to the end of the book. Not huge spoilers, just to give you an idea of the vibes that I got from the book. It felt kind of Illuminati-ish, and I didn't love that angle on it. I feel like this book could have just been done a little better, and the terrorism part could have been done a little better. I don't know. It was weird. But basically, all Muslims are apparently terrorists, and this book is like, no, not all Muslims are terrorists. Actually, most of us are just regular people. But of course, you gotta stereotype everybody who shares a single trait, because that's how labels work. But it was fine. I read it. It was good. I'd probably read it again and see if my thoughts change in the future. Then we have The Merry Spinster, Tales of Everyday Horror. So for the author of this book is trans. The name of the author on the book is Mallory Ortberg. However, if you put that name into Google, you get a completely different name. It's Daniel something. I should have looked it up before doing this video, but I'll put it up on the screen. So while the author name is Mallory Ortberg, I don't really think that's the proper name at this point, but I don't know if they're going to update the book cover or if they have updated the book cover. But anyways, The Merry Spinster is a retelling of some fairy tales, and I mostly enjoyed it. I didn't love all of the stories, but I think the reason that I didn't like this book as much as I was expecting is because I wasn't familiar with a lot of the stories. There were some familiar ones. There was a Princess and the Frog retelling, there was a Little Mermaid retelling, but a lot of them were stories that I just wasn't familiar with. So if I try reading this again, I want to make sure to look up the original stories first. I should really just always do that. Whenever... Hot tip for the future, if you're ever going to read a retelling of a story, make sure to read the original first, or at least to know what the original is and have the basic idea of the story, because then you'll enjoy a retelling a lot more. But I liked the creepier aspects of it. These are some darker stories. There was a lot of gender play in the story, so if you're looking for a selection of some queer short stories and you're into fantasy and retellings, then check this book out. And then the last one was The Handmaid's Tale, which I actually do have on my shelf. I read this with Victoria from What Victoria Read, with her kind of book club, What the Book Club Read. We are going through Margaret Atwood novels, one novel at a time, 1 month at a time, from the beginning of her writing on, and this one is the only Margaret Atwood that I read the whole way through before joining the book club, and really loved it then. I think I loved it even more now. I still haven't seen that much of the show. I've seen like half of season 1, but stuff that I can deal with in books can just really put me in a dark spot in film. And as much as I've tried to love The Handmaid's Tale, I do think it's a very well done show. I just can't get myself to sit down and watch it. It depresses me, and I just don't want to do that to myself. But the book is great. It's not as plot heavy as I remember it being. It's really more about character building and building the world through the characters rather than creating a plot, but she does it really well in this. Usually I want a pretty plot heavy book, but this was super well done. I really enjoyed it. Would recommend if you haven't read it yet. So that is it. I think from here on out, to save myself a little bit of the work, I'm probably not going to do any more of the read some friggin' booksathon stats until the end of the year, and then I'll just do like a collective year thing of stats, since this is my last full month wrap up. Or maybe I'll just put it in a monthly video with some monthly stats. I don't know. I'll figure that out eventually. But you've been sitting here too long. I'm sure you're bored of me. So please like, subscribe, be my friend on social media, and I'll see all of you in my next video. Bye, friends.